"I ride harder than any of your men," boasted the Apache maiden. The rancher smirked, then watched in disbelief. The dust hadn't even settled from the morning stampede when she appeared on the ridge like a vision carved from lightning itself. Her silhouette cut sharp against the crimson New Mexico sky, long black hair whipping in the desert wind as her painted stallion pawed the rocky ground beneath them. Most men would have reached for their rifles. Garrett Calloway reached for his hat instead, tipping it slightly as recognition dawned. She was trouble. The kind that rode bareback and left hearts scattered like tumbleweeds across the territory. The year was 1879, and the Calloway Ranch stretched across 15,000 acres of unforgiving desert between Santa Fe and Albuquerque. Garrett had inherited the spread from his father 3 years prior, along with a reputation for being harder than the volcanic rock that jutted from his grazing lands. At 30, he commanded respect from every cowhand, cattle baron, and territorial official from the Rio Grande to the Colorado border, everyone except her. Ayanna moved down the slope with the fluid grace of someone born to the saddle. Her Apache heritage showed in every controlled movement, every calculated decision as she guided her horse through terrain that would challenge seasoned cavalry officers. She wore traditional buckskin adorned with intricate beadwork that caught the morning light, but her eyes held something far more modern, a fierce intelligence that had been honed by years of navigating two worlds. The ranch hands stopped their work to stare. Some had heard whispers about the Apache woman who could outride any man in 3 territories. Others knew her only as a ghost story told around campfires, a mythical figure who appeared when least expected and vanished just as quickly. But Garrett knew better. He knew exactly who she was and why she had come. 6 months earlier, a dispute over water rights had erupted between the Mescalero Apache Reservation and the surrounding cattle ranches. The territorial government, eager to expand settlement and increase tax revenue, had quietly begun redistributing access to the vital spring-fed streams that had sustained the Apache people for generations. Legal challenges moved slowly through corrupt territorial courts while cattle died of thirst and tensions mounted on both sides. Ayanna had emerged as an unexpected voice in the negotiations. Educated at the Carlisle Indian Industrial School in Pennsylvania, she spoke flawless English and understood Anglo law better than most attorneys. But unlike the government-appointed tribal representatives who seemed content to accept whatever scraps were offered, she possessed something dangerous, the absolute conviction that her people deserved better. Her stallion, a magnificent paint horse named Hokie, stepped onto the hard-packed dirt of the ranch yard. The animal's coat gleamed with sweat and dust, evidence of a hard ride across the desert. Ayanna's dark eyes swept over the assembled ranch hands before settling on Garrett with unmistakable challenge. The silence stretched like a taut rope ready to snap. Garrett stepped forward, his boots echoing against the wooden porch of the main house. He was tall and lean, weathered by years of desert sun and hard work. His reputation for fairness was matched only by his reputation for ruthlessness when crossed. Today he found himself curious which version of himself would be required. The ranch sprawled around them like a small town. The main house, built from adobe and timber, dominated the central courtyard. Outbuildings included a massive barn, bunkhouses for the hands, a blacksmith shop, and corrals that could hold 300 head of cattle. Everything was designed for efficiency and durability, qualities that had served the Calloway family well in this harsh land. Ayanna dismounted with practiced ease, never breaking eye contact with Garrett. Her movements were economical, purposeful. She tied Hokie to the hitching post with quick, sure knots that spoke of countless hours in the saddle. The morning heat was already building, promising another scorching day. Cicadas buzzed in the scattered cottonwood trees, and somewhere in the distance, a meadowlark called across the grassland. The smell of horses, leather, and dust filled the air, the eternal perfume of the frontier. "Miss Ayanna," Garrett said, his voice carrying across the yard. "Unexpected pleasure." Mr. Calloway. Her voice held no warmth, but it carried clearly in the still air. We need to talk. The ranch hands exchanged glances. This was the woman who had humiliated 3 of their number in a horse race just 2 months prior, winning a purse of $50 and leaving the men afoot in the middle of nowhere. That incident had become legend, growing with each telling until some versions had her riding backwards while braiding her hair. Garrett gestured toward the house. Coffee's fresh. She shook her head. This isn't a social call. The tension ratcheted higher. Several hands drifted closer, ostensibly returning to their work but clearly positioning themselves within earshot. Trouble had a way of finding the Calloway ranch, and experience had taught them to be ready for anything. Ayanna reached into her saddlebag and withdrew a rolled document sealed with official territorial wax. The paper crackled as she unrolled it, revealing dense legal text that few present could read, but all could recognize as government business. New water allocations, she announced. Effective immediately, Apache access to Bitter Creek and the Three Sisters Springs is reduced to 4 hours per day. Dawn to mid-morning only. Garrett's jaw tightened. Those were the primary water sources for his southern pastures. If the Apache were limited to morning access, his cattle would have the streams for the hottest part of each day. It was a significant advantage, one that would save him thousands of dollars in lost livestock during the brutal summer months ahead. It was also morally indefensible. I didn't request those changes, he said carefully. But you didn't oppose them either. Her accusation cut through the morning air like a blade. The Territorial Council held 3 hearings. Your name appears on none of the attendance records. She was right, and they both knew it. Garrett had avoided the hearings precisely because he had known they would force him to choose between his financial interests and his conscience. By staying away, he had allowed others to make decisions that would benefit his ranch while keeping his hands technically clean. Cowardice disguised as pragmatism, the document rustled as wind caught its edges. Ayanna held it steady, waiting for his response. Around them, the normal sounds of ranch life continued. Horses nickering in the corrals, the ring of hammer on anvil from the blacksmith shop, the creak of windmill blades turning in the breeze. What do you want from me? Garrett asked. Justice. The word hung between them like a challenge. But I'll settle for a fair fight. Confusion flickered across several faces among the assembled ranch hands. A fair fight could mean anything from a formal duel to a legal challenge. With Ayanna, it was impossible to predict. She gestured toward the corrals where 24 horses moved restlessly in the morning heat. Your men claim to be the finest riders in the territory. I say they're soft city boys who wouldn't last an hour in Apache country. That's quite an accusation. It's a fact. Her confidence was absolute. I propose a contest. If I can outride your best man, you use your influence with the Territorial Council to restore fair water access to my people. And if you lose, I won't. The simple certainty in her voice sent ripples of unease through the watching cowboys. This wasn't bravado or empty boasting. This was a woman stating a fact as immutable as sunrise. Garrett found himself genuinely curious about her proposition. The territorial water rights were a complex legal matter involving multiple ranches, government bureaucrats, and competing business interests. His influence, while considerable, had limits. Assuming I could deliver on such an agreement, he said slowly, what kind of contest did you have in mind? Ayanna smiled for the first time since arriving, and the expression transformed her face from stern beauty to something approaching radiance. A race. 25 miles across the Devil's Backbone to Skeleton Rock and back. First one to return with a token from the summit wins. Several ranch hands whistled low. The Devil's Backbone was a notorious ridge of jagged, volcanic rock that stretched across the most treacherous terrain in the territory. The trail was barely wide enough for a single horse, with drop-offs on both sides that had claimed the lives of more than a few overconfident riders. Skeleton Rock marked the halfway point, a towering spire of red. sandstone that rose 300 feet above the surrounding desert. It was a course that demanded not just riding skill, but intimate knowledge of the land, perfect timing, and the kind of desperate courage that separated the living from the dead. 25 miles in this heat would kill most horses, Garrett observed. Most horses, Ayanna agreed. Most riders, too. The challenge was becoming clearer. This wasn't just about water rights or proving a point. This was about something deeper, a test of character that would reveal who these people truly were when everything was stripped away except skill, determination, and raw will to survive. Garrett studied her face, searching for any sign of doubt or hesitation. He found none. Whatever drove this woman ran deeper than simple tribal loyalty or legal grievance. She was fighting for something that existed beyond property lines or government documents. When? He asked. Today, high noon. The timing was brutal. Noon meant racing through the worst heat of the day, when temperatures could climb above 100 degrees and mirages turned the desert into a furnace of deception. It would be a test of endurance as much as skill. I'll need time to select my rider. You'll ride yourself. The words hit like a physical blow. Garrett had been assuming she would challenge one of his ranch hands, probably Jake Morrison, who had won the territorial championship 3 years running, or maybe Tom Reeves, whose reputation with horses was legendary throughout New Mexico territory. Me specifically? The man who makes the decisions should face the consequences. It was a direct challenge to his leadership, his courage, and his integrity. Every ranch hand present understood the implications. If Garrett backed down, his authority would be permanently damaged. If he accepted and lost, his reputation would suffer almost as much. If he accepted and won, he would have defeated the finest rider in Apache territory and secured water rights that could make the difference between prosperity and bankruptcy for his ranch. The risks were enormous. The Devil's Backbone had killed experienced riders under ideal conditions. Racing it in the heat of the day against someone with Ayanna's skill was courting disaster, but refusing was unthinkable. Agreed, he said. Ayanna nodded once, sharp and final. 2 hours to prepare. We meet at the Devil's Head trailhead. She swung back onto Hokie with liquid grace and wheeled the horse toward the gate. But instead of leaving immediately, she paused and looked back over her shoulder. Mr. Calloway? Don't disappoint me. Then she was gone, riding hard toward the shimmering horizon where heat waves danced like spirits above the desert floor. The silence that followed was deafening. Jake Morrison, Garrett's foreman and most trusted hand, stepped forward. His weathered face showed deep concern beneath the shadow of his hat brim. Boss, that woman rides like she was born on horseback. Word is she's been racing that trail since she was 12 years old. I've heard the stories. Then you know what you're up against. She's not just fast, she's smart. Knows every rock, every turn, every place where a horse can find footing. This isn't about proving who's the better rider. This is about her homeland. Garrett understood. For Ayanna, this race represented more than water rights or tribal dignity. It was about the fundamental question of whether her people would be allowed to survive as more than museum pieces and government dependents. For him, it was about discovering whether he was the man he claimed to be or just another opportunist hiding behind inherited wealth and political connections. The next 2 hours would determine the answer. He turned toward the corrals where his horses waited, their coats gleaming in the strengthening sun. Somewhere among them was his chance at redemption or his appointment with disaster. The desert stretched endlessly in all directions, beautiful and merciless under the vast blue sky. By evening, it would know which of them possessed the stronger will to survive. Garrett walked slowly toward the corrals, his mind racing through possibilities and calculations. The assembled ranch hands parted before him like water, their faces reflecting mixtures of concern, excitement, and barely concealed doubt. Word would spread quickly across the territory about this challenge. By sunset, every saloon from Santa Fe to Las Cruces would be buzzing with speculation about the outcome. The corrals held some of the finest horseflesh in New Mexico territory. Garrett's father had spent decades building this herd, selecting for speed, endurance, and intelligence. These animals had been bred specifically for the harsh demands of desert ranching, where a horse's stamina could mean the difference between life and death. His eyes moved systematically across the horses, evaluating each animal's potential for the ordeal ahead. Thunder, a magnificent black stallion with white markings, possessed incredible speed, but had never been tested on terrain as treacherous as the Devil's Backbone. Whiskey, a bay gelding with proven endurance, might have the staying power for the distance, but lacked the agility needed for the narrow mountain passages. Then his gaze settled on Bandit. The horse was smaller than the others, a compact sorrel mare with intelligent dark eyes and scars along her flanks that told stories of previous adventures. She had been rescued as a yearling from a flash flood 3 years earlier, nearly drowned and half wild with terror. Most men would have put her down as damaged goods, but something in her spirit had caught Garrett's attention. The rehabilitation had taken months. Bandit's trust, once broken, proved difficult to rebuild. She remained skittish around strangers and would only accept Garrett's touch without flinching. But gradually, a bond had formed between them that transcended the typical relationship between rider and mount. Bandit possessed an uncanny ability to read terrain and anticipate danger. She had carried Garrett safely through avalanche zones, across raging rivers, and over mountain passes that had claimed other horses and riders. More importantly, she seemed to understand when everything was at stake. Jake Morrison approached, leading a magnificent paint horse that pranced and tossed its head in the morning heat. "Boss, what about Apache Wind here? He's fast as lightning and stronger than any horse we've got." Garrett shook his head. "Too proud. A horse like that might try to prove something instead of just surviving." "Then Thunder? That stallion's got speed to burn. Speed won't matter if we're both dead at the bottom of a canyon." He entered Bandit's corral slowly, allowing the mare to catch his scent and recognize his approach. She lifted her head from the water trough and nickered softly, a sound that spoke of partnership forged through shared trials. "Hello, girl," he murmured, running his hand along her neck. "Ready for one more adventure?" Bandit's ears pricked forward, and she stepped closer, pressing her muzzle against his chest. The gesture was almost human in its intimacy, a moment of connection that reminded Garrett why he had chosen this life despite its constant dangers. The next hour passed in careful preparation. Garrett inspected every piece of tack with meticulous attention, checking leather for weak spots, adjusting stirrups for optimal balance, and ensuring that every buckle and strap could withstand the punishment ahead. His saddle was a custom creation by the finest craftsmen in Santa Fe, designed specifically for long-distance riding across difficult terrain. Water would be crucial. The desert heat would dehydrate both horse and rider within hours, potentially leading to heat stroke, disorientation, and death. Garrett filled 2 canteens with cool water from the ranch well and attached them securely to his saddle. A third container, designed specifically for Bandit, would provide the mare with necessary hydration during brief rest stops. Food was less critical for a race of this duration, but energy would matter in the final miles. Garrett packed dried beef, hardtack biscuits, and a small bag of sugar cubes that Bandit particularly enjoyed. The weight was minimal, but the psychological boost of sharing a treat with his horse during the most demanding portions of the journey could prove invaluable. His clothing required careful consideration. The desert sun would be merciless, but heavy fabrics would trap heat and reduce mobility. He selected a lightweight cotton shirt, well-worn leather chaps that would protect his legs from thorny brush, and a wide-brimmed hat that would shield his face and neck from direct sunlight. Most importantly, he chose boots with thick leather soles and reinforced heels. If Bandit suffered injury and he was forced to continue on foot, proper footwear could mean the difference between reaching safety and becoming another desert casualty. The ranch hands gathered to watch his preparations, their usual banter replaced by serious concentration. These men understood horses and racing better than most, and their silence spoke volumes about the magnitude of the challenge ahead. Tom Reeves, the ranch's horse trainer, stepped forward with a leather pouch containing liniment and basic veterinary supplies. "For the mare," he said quietly. "Case she pulls something or gets cut up on the rocks. Appreciate it, Tom." "Boss?" The voice belonged to Miguel Santos, a young vaquero who had joined the ranch only 6 months earlier. "My grandmother, she lived through the Apache wars. Says that woman, Ayana, she rides like the wind spirits themselves guide her path." "Superstition, Miguel." "Maybe, but my grandmother also says the spirits protect those who fight for their family's survival." The comment struck closer to home than Garrett cared to admit. This race represented more than personal pride or business interests. For Ayana, defeat would mean watching her people slowly lose access to the resources necessary for their traditional way of life. For him, victory would come at the cost of perpetuating an injustice he was uniquely positioned to prevent. But backing down now would accomplish nothing except destroying his credibility and ensuring that future negotiations would proceed without his input. Sometimes the only way forward was through the fire. Jake Morrison checked his pocket watch, a silver timepiece that had belonged to his father. "11:15, boss. Time to head out if you want to reach the Devil's Head by noon." Garrett swung into the saddle, feeling Bandit's familiar strength beneath him. The mare stepped lightly, eager to be moving after the morning's confinement in the corral. Her ears swiveled constantly, alert to every sound and movement in the bustling ranch yard. The ride to the Devil's Head trailhead would take 25 minutes across relatively flat terrain. It would serve as a warm-up for both horse and rider, allowing them to settle into the rhythm that would be crucial during the more demanding portions of the race. As they left the ranch compound, several hands called out words of encouragement and advice. Their loyalty was genuine, but Garrett could see the concern in their faces. They had all heard stories about the devil's backbone, and none of those stories ended well for careless or unprepared riders. The landscape gradually shifted from the cultivated green of the ranch to the wild beauty of the open desert. Sagebrush and mesquite dotted the sandy soil, while distant mountains shimmered like mirages in the strengthening heat. A red-tailed hawk circled overhead, riding thermal currents with effortless grace. Bandit's hoofbeats fell into a steady rhythm against the hard-packed earth. The mare's gait was smooth and economical, covering ground efficiently while conserving energy for the trials ahead. This was how they had traveled countless miles together, horse and rider moving as a single unit through some of the most unforgiving terrain in North America. The Devil's Head appeared gradually, first as a dark smudge on the horizon, then with increasing clarity as a massive rock formation that jutted from the desert floor like the spine of some prehistoric beast. The trail began at its base and wound upward through increasingly treacherous terrain, following ridgelines barely wide enough for a single horse. Local Apache legends claim the formation was created when a great spirit warrior battled demons that had risen from the underworld to plague the living. The battle had raged for 7 days and nights, reshaping the very landscape with its fury. When the Demon King was finally defeated, his spine had turned to stone, creating the jagged ridge that now challenged anyone brave or foolish enough to attempt its passage. Garrett had always dismissed such stories as colorful folklore, but riding toward the forbidding rock face under the blazing desert sun, he found himself reconsidering. There was something undeniably ominous about the formation, a sense of ancient violence frozen in stone. Ayana was already waiting when he arrived. She sat motionless on Hoki's back, positioned precisely at the beginning of the trail that led up into the rocks. Horse and rider appeared carved from the same elemental materials as the landscape around them, perfectly integrated with their environment in a way that spoke of generations of inherited knowledge. The paint stallion was magnificent, his coat gleaming with health and careful grooming. But it was his bearing that truly impressed, the alert intelligence in his dark eyes, the perfect balance of relaxation and readiness, the unmistakable confidence of an animal that had never encountered terrain he could not master. Ayanna had changed clothes since her morning visit to the ranch. She now wore riding attire that was both practical and beautiful, combining traditional Apache designs with adaptations necessary for serious horsemanship. Her hair was braided tightly and secured with leather thongs that would prevent it from interfering with her vision during the race. Most striking were her boots, knee-high moccasins crafted from supple leather and decorated with intricate beadwork. They were works of art, but more importantly, they were perfectly suited for maintaining secure contact with her horse while allowing the flexibility needed for navigating treacherous footing. "You came," she said as Garrett approached. "Did you think I wouldn't? I hoped you would surprise me." The comment carried layers of meaning that Garrett chose not to explore. Instead, he focused on the immediate challenge, studying the trail that disappeared into the rock maze above them. The Devil's Backbone stretched for over 12 miles, following ridge lines and canyon rims that demanded absolute precision from both horse and rider. A single misstep could result in a fall of hundreds of feet onto jagged rocks below. The trail was marked sporadically with cairns built by previous travelers, but weather and time had scattered many of these markers, leaving gaps where navigation required intimate knowledge of the terrain. Skeleton Rock, their destination, rose like a crimson tower at the trail's furthest point. The formation was visible from the starting point as a distant spire, but the route to reach it wound through a labyrinth of canyons and ridges that could easily disorient even experienced riders. "The rules are simple," Ayanna announced. "First rider to return with a token from Skeleton Rock wins. No interference with the other rider's horse or equipment. If either horse is seriously injured, the race ends with no winner." "Agreed. If you fall and are injured, I will stop to help you." "Same here." She nodded approval of his answer. Despite the competition between them, they were venturing into country where mutual assistance might mean the difference between life and death. The sun reached its zenith, casting short, sharp shadows and transforming the air into a shimmering furnace. Heat waves rose from the rocks, creating optical illusions that would become more pronounced as the day progressed. Ayanna raised her hand, and for a moment the desert fell completely silent. Even the constant buzz of insects seemed to pause in anticipation of what was to come. "Now," she said. Both horses exploded into motion simultaneously. The first 100 yards were deceptive, following a relatively gentle incline across loose shale that crunched beneath pounding hooves. Hokie took an early lead, his powerful stride eating up ground with mechanical efficiency. But Garrett knew this opening stretch was meaningless, a false promise before the trail transformed into something far more demanding. Bandit settled into her natural rhythm, content to trail slightly behind while studying the terrain ahead. The mare's ears constantly swiveled forward and back, processing sounds and movements that human senses could never detect. She had learned long ago that patience often proved more valuable than raw speed. The temperature was already brutal. Heat radiated from the rocks in visible waves, creating a furnace effect that would intensify as they climbed higher into the canyon system. Garrett could feel sweat beginning to gather beneath his shirt, and they had barely begun the ascent. Ahead, Ayanna rode with fluid grace that made her appear almost weightless in the saddle. She moved in perfect harmony with her horse, anticipating each shift in balance and adjusting her position milliseconds before it became necessary. Her technique was flawless, honed by thousands of hours spent navigating terrain that would challenge the most experienced cavalry officers. The trail began to narrow as they approached the first real test, a section known locally as the Needle's Eye. Here, the path squeezed between two towering rock walls, creating a corridor barely wide enough for a single horse. The passage extended for nearly 50 yards, with sheer drops on both sides that plunged into darkness. Ayanna entered the Needle's Eye first, her advantage in positioning giving her right of way through the constricted space. Hoki's hooves rang against solid rock as they navigated the treacherous passage, each step requiring absolute precision. One stumble here would send both horse and rider tumbling into the abyss. Garrett waited at the entrance until they cleared the far end, then urged Bandit forward into the echoing corridor. The Mari's nostrils flared as she caught the scent of previous travelers who had not been as fortunate, but she moved steadily onward, trusting her rider's judgment completely. The rock walls seemed to press inward, creating an oppressive sensation that tested the nerve of both participants. This was where many riders discovered they lacked the psychological fortitude necessary for the devil's backbone. The knowledge that death waited mere inches away with every step required a special kind of courage. Bandit cleared the passage without incident, emerging into blazing sunlight that momentarily blinded both horse and rider after the shadowy corridor. Ahead, the trail split into 3 possible routes, each offering different advantages and risks. Ayanna had chosen the middle path, which appeared to offer the most direct route towards Skeleton Rock. But Garrett had studied maps of this region extensively, and he knew that appearances could be fatally deceiving. The middle route was indeed shorter, but it included several sections where recent rock slides had left the footing uncertain. He guided Bandit toward the left-hand trail, accepting additional distance in exchange for more reliable terrain. It was a calculated gamble that would either prove his superior knowledge of the country or cost him the race through overcautious navigation. The sun climbed higher, transforming the canyon into a natural oven. Heat reflected off every surface, creating multiple sources of radiant energy that seemed determined to sap the strength from both horses and riders. Water would become crucial within the next hour, and both participants carried only limited supplies. The left trail proved both blessing and curse. Garrett's choice rewarded him with solid footing and predictable terrain. But the route climbed steeply through a series of switchbacks that demanded careful pacing. Bandit's breathing remained steady as they ascended, her mountain-bred endurance serving them well in the thinning air. From his elevated position, Garrett could occasionally glimpse Ayanna threading through the more direct middle passage. She had gained significant ground during the first mile, but her route was forcing both horse and rider to navigate unstable scree slopes where loose rocks could trigger deadly avalanches. The canyon walls rose higher on both sides, creating a natural amphitheater that amplified every sound. Bandit's hoofbeats echoed off stone surfaces, joined by the distant percussion of Hoki's passage through parallel terrain. The acoustic effect was disorienting, making it difficult to judge the true distance between the two riders. Heat continued building with merciless intensity. The sun had passed its zenith, but temperatures were still climbing as the rock faces absorbed and reflected solar energy. Garrett's shirt was soaked with perspiration, and he could see foam beginning to gather around Bandit's bit. Both horse and rider were approaching the limits of comfortable exertion. He reached for his first canteen and took a measured sip, allowing the lukewarm water to moisten his parched throat without drinking enough to cause cramping. Water discipline would be crucial during the hours ahead. Too little would lead to dehydration and impaired judgment. Too much would burden his system when every ounce of efficiency mattered. Bandit sensed his movement and slowed expectantly. Garrett poured a small amount of water into his cupped palm and offered it to the Mare, who lapped gratefully at the precious liquid. Her dark eyes reflected trust and determination that strengthened his own resolve. The trail leveled briefly as they reached a narrow plateau carved from solid granite. Here, ancient geological forces had created a natural viewing platform that offered panoramic vistas of the surrounding desert. Under different circumstances, the scenery would have been breathtaking. Today, it merely confirmed how far they still had to travel. Skeleton Rock dominated the northeastern horizon, its distinctive red spire rising nearly 300 feet above the surrounding landscape. The formation appeared deceptively close, but Garrett's experience with desert distances warned him that at least 8 miles of brutal terrain still lay between their current position and their destination. More concerning was the complete absence of any sign indicating Ayana's progress. The middle trail should have brought her within visual range by now, unless she had encountered serious difficulty or discovered a route that offered even greater advantages than expected. A hawk's cry echoed across the canyon, answered by another from an unseen perch among the rocks. The birds served as natural scouts, their keen vision capable of detecting movement across vast distances. Their calls might be announcing the presence of both riders to any observers below. Garrett urged Bandit forward, following the trail as it curved around a massive boulder and plunged into a narrow defile between towering cliff faces. The passage was longer than the needle's eye but wider, allowing more room for maneuvering if conditions became difficult. The temperature dropped noticeably as they entered the shaded corridor. Rock walls blocked direct sunlight, creating a welcome respite from the desert furnace. But relief came at a price. The confined space concentrated sound and movement, making it impossible to detect potential hazards until they appeared directly ahead. Bandit's ears pricked forward suddenly, and her stride shortened with characteristic wariness. The Mare had detected something that human senses could not yet perceive, some disturbance in the natural harmony of their surroundings. Then Garrett heard it, the unmistakable sound of falling rock somewhere ahead. The noise was brief but significant, suggesting that either geological instability or another presence had disturbed the delicate balance of the canyon system. They emerged from the defile to find Ayana waiting beside a small spring that trickled from a crack in the rock face. Both she and Hoki appeared unharmed, but her expression revealed frustration and concern. "Rockslide blocked the direct route," she explained as Garrett approached. "Lost 20 minutes finding alternate passage." Her willingness to share tactical information surprised him. Competition demanded strategic secrecy, but survival in this environment required different priorities. The desert killed those who allowed pride to override practical wisdom. How bad was it? Bad enough. Whole section of trail just gone, probably happened during the spring storms. Had to backtrack and find another way around. Garrett dismounted and led Bandit to the spring, allowing the Mare to drink while he studied their current position. The delay had cost Ayana her early advantage, bringing them roughly even in terms of progress toward Skeleton Rock. But it had also provided valuable intelligence about trail conditions that would affect their return journey. "We should move," Ayana said. "Still got 6 miles to go, and the afternoon heat is building." She was right. The brief respite in the shaded canyon had provided temporary relief, but temperatures would continue climbing for another 2 hours. The most brutal portion of the race lay directly ahead, where exposed ridgelines offered no protection from the merciless sun. Both riders mounted simultaneously and resumed the competition. The trail ahead split again, this time offering only 2 options. The right fork climbed steeply toward a high ridge that promised spectacular views but demanded enormous expenditure of energy. The left fork followed a more gradual ascent through a series of connected valleys that would provide occasional shade but required covering additional distance. Without discussion, both riders chose the right fork. The ascent began immediately, testing both horses with a relentless climb that seemed to stretch endlessly upward. Bandit's breathing deepened as she attacked the slope, her powerful hindquarters driving them steadily higher. Beside them, Hoki matched their pace with mechanical precision, his larger frame providing advantages in raw power that began to show as the incline steepened. Ayana had resumed her position slightly ahead, her superior knowledge of the terrain allowing her to choose the most efficient line through the scattered boulders and loose rock that littered the trail. But Garrett could see the effort was costing both horse and rider. Sweat darkened Hoki's coat, and Ayana's normally perfect posture showed subtle signs of fatigue. The ridge top, when they finally reached it, offered views that justified every agonizing step of the climb. The entire territory spread below them like a living map, with settlements, ranches, and geographical features clearly visible across vast distances. The Rio Grande traced a silver ribbon through the landscape, while distant mountain ranges marked the boundaries of their known world. But beauty was a luxury they could not afford. Skeleton Rock loomed directly ahead, no longer a distant spire but an imposing tower of red sandstone that dominated the local geography. The trail leading to its base was clearly visible, winding through a maze of smaller formations that would provide the day's final test of riding skill. 3 miles, Ayana said, her voice carrying clearly in the thin air. Straight down and back up. The descent proved even more treacherous than the climb. Loose stones and unstable footing created constant hazards for both horses, while the steep angle placed enormous stress on their forelegs and shoulders. Bandit picked her way carefully through the obstacles, choosing each step with deliberate caution. Hoki's larger size became a disadvantage on the narrow, winding trail. The stallion's hooves scattered rocks that cascaded into the valley below, creating small avalanches that spoke of the mountain's instability. Ayana was forced to check his speed repeatedly, allowing Garrett and Bandit to close the gap between them. By the time they reached the valley floor, both riders were roughly even again. The constant changes in elevation, combined with the brutal heat, had pushed both horses near the limits of their endurance. Foam flecked their coats, and their breathing had become labored despite the careful pacing both riders had attempted to maintain. Skeleton Rock rose directly before them, its summit marked by a distinctive overhang that had given the formation its ominous name. Local legend claimed that Apache warriors had once used the peak as a vision quest site, fasting and praying until spirits revealed the paths their lives should follow. The final approach required dismounting and leading their horses up a narrow trail carved into the rock face itself. The path was barely wide enough for a single animal, with precipitous drops on one side and sheer stone walls on the other. Hand and footholds had been carved by previous travelers, but time and weather had worn many of them smooth. Ayana began the ascent first, her moccasined feet finding purchase on surfaces that seemed impossible to navigate. Hoki followed with surprising agility for such a large animal, his trust in his rider absolute despite the terrifying exposure. Garrett waited until they had gained sufficient separation, then began his own climb. Bandit hesitated momentarily at the base of the trail, her equine instincts warning of the dangers ahead. But her bond with Garrett overcame her natural caution, and she followed him onto the treacherous path. The climb took nearly 30 minutes. Each step required careful evaluation of the footing, while constant awareness of the deadly drop just inches away tested the nerve of both human and animal participants. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly, turning the rock face into a natural griddle that seared exposed skin. Ayana reached the summit first, but by a margin of less than 2 minutes. She had already secured her token, a distinctive piece of red sandstone that could only have come from Skeleton Rock's distinctive peak, and was preparing for the descent when Garrett arrived. The view from the summit was spectacular, offering 360-degree vistas of the surrounding territory. But both riders were focused on the immediate challenge of returning safely to ground level with their precious tokens intact. "Congratulations on making it this far," Ayana said as Garrett collected his own piece of sandstone. "Most riders never see this view. The hard part's still ahead. Always is." The return journey began with the same careful descent, but the afternoon heat had intensified the risks considerably. Rock surfaces that had been merely warm during their ascent were now hot enough to burn exposed skin. Both horses showed signs of serious fatigue, their movements becoming more cautious and deliberate with each step. The race was far from over. If anything, the return trip would prove more demanding than their outward journey. Heat exhaustion, dehydration, and simple fatigue would test their endurance far more severely than any obstacle they had yet encountered. As they regained the valley floor and remounted their horses, both riders understood that the true competition was just beginning. The next few hours would determine not just the winner of their wager, but whether both participants would survive to see another sunset. Skeleton Rock cast its shadow across the trail as they began the long journey home, its distinctive silhouette serving as a reminder of how far they had come and how much further they still had to go. The desert heat shimmered around them like a living thing, distorting distance and direction in ways that could prove fatal to the unwary. But both riders had tokens clutched in their hands, physical proof that they had met the challenge and earned the right to claim victory. Now they just had to survive the return trip. The afternoon sun was beginning its descent toward the western horizon, but temperatures would remain brutal for hours to come. The race was approaching its climax, and the desert was about to reveal which rider possessed the stronger will to survive. Ayanna took the lead as they departed Skeleton Rock, her intimate knowledge of the return route providing crucial advantages. But Garrett had studied her technique during their outward journey, learning valuable lessons about efficient navigation through treacherous terrain. The competition was far from decided, and the most dangerous portion of their journey lay directly ahead. The first mile of the return journey revealed the true cost of their outward climb. Both horses moved with labored breathing, their steps less sure than they had been hours earlier. The relentless heat had sapped strength from even these supremely conditioned animals, and the most challenging terrain still awaited them. Bandit's coat was dark with sweat, foam gathering around her bit and bridle. But her eyes remained alert, ears constantly moving to track sounds and potential dangers. The Mare had reserves of determination that matched her physical capabilities, drawing on the deep bond forged through years of partnership with Garrett. Hoki appeared equally stressed, his larger frame making him more susceptible to heat exhaustion despite his superior power. Steam rose from his flanks in the superheated air, and his breathing had developed a rasp that concerned even Ayanna's expert eye. But the stallion continued forward with unwavering commitment, responding to his rider's subtle commands with mechanical precision. The trail ahead wound through a series of interconnected canyons known locally as the Devil's Maze. These passages had been carved over millennia by flash floods that roared down from the high country during summer storms, creating a labyrinth of narrow corridors and unexpected dead ends. Navigation required intimate knowledge of landmarks that were often obscured by heat shimmer and exhaustion-induced disorientation. Ayanna maintained her slight lead, but Garrett could see the effort was costing her dearly. Her normally erect posture had begun to sag, and she was drinking from her water supply more frequently than optimal pacing would suggest. The Apache woman was pushing herself to the edge of heat exhaustion in her determination to win the water rights that would preserve her people's way of life. The moral complexity of the situation weighed heavily on Garrett's conscience. Victory would secure valuable resources for his ranch and maintain his reputation throughout the territory. But defeating Ayanna meant condemning her people to continued marginalization and eventual displacement from lands they had occupied for countless generations. Yet backing down or deliberately losing would accomplish nothing constructive. The Territorial Council's decisions were driven by economic and political considerations that transcended individual conscience. Only a legitimate victory by Ayanna could provide the leverage necessary to force meaningful negotiations. The trail entered a particularly narrow section where canyon walls rose nearly 200 feet on both sides, blocking direct sunlight but creating an oven effect that concentrated the day's accumulated heat. The passage stretched for nearly half a mile, with several sharp turns that prevented riders from seeing more than 50 yards ahead. Bandits' hooves rang against stone as they navigated the confined space. The sound echoed repeatedly off the surrounding walls, creating an acoustic signature that revealed their exact position to anyone within miles of their location. Privacy was impossible in this environment, where every movement announced itself to the surrounding wilderness. A sudden clattering from ahead brought both riders to immediate attention. The sound was unmistakably that of falling rocks, but its source remained hidden beyond the next curve in the passage. Both horses tensed, their natural instincts warning of potential danger in the confined space. Ayana appeared around the bend seconds later, leading Hoki carefully over a fresh rockfall that blocked nearly half the passage width. The stallion picked his way delicately through the debris, testing each step before committing his full weight to potentially unstable footing. "Slide happened while we were climbing Skeleton Rock," she called back to Garrett. "Trail's passable, but barely." The obstacle forced both riders to dismount and lead their horses through the debris field on foot. Sharp stone fragments threatened to cut unprotected hooves, while loose rocks shifted treacherously beneath both human and animal weight. Progress slowed to a careful crawl as each step required individual evaluation. Bandit's mountain breeding served her well in the treacherous footing. The Mare had learned to read rock stability through years of navigating similar terrain, placing each hoof with deliberate precision that avoided unstable surfaces. But the delay cost precious time as afternoon temperatures continued climbing toward their daily peak. Clearing the rockfall required nearly 20 minutes, bringing both riders dangerously close to the limits of their water supplies. Garrett had consumed half his original allocation, while the stress of leading her horse through difficult terrain had forced Ayana to drink even more frequently. Remounting beyond the obstacle, both riders faced a sobering reality. The return journey was proving far more demanding than their outward trip, with accumulated fatigue and dehydration affecting both human and animal participants. The final 8 miles to the Devil's Head would test their endurance far more severely than any challenge they had yet encountered. The canyon opened gradually as they progressed, revealing the stark beauty of the desert landscape under late afternoon light. Long shadows stretched across the terrain, providing occasional respite from direct solar radiation. But relief was temporary. The sun would not set for several hours, and its angle was becoming increasingly severe as it dropped toward the western horizon. A red-tailed hawk circled overhead, riding thermal currents with effortless grace. The bird's presence suggested that carrion might be present somewhere in the vicinity, a grim reminder of how many travelers had underestimated the dangers of this particular route. Ayana's lead had shrunk to less than 50 yards as they entered a relatively flat section that offered opportunities for increased speed. But both horses were showing clear signs of distress. Their gaits had lost the fluid efficiency that had characterized the early stages of the race, becoming choppy and irregular as fatigue affected their natural coordination. Hoki stumbled slightly on a patch of loose gravel, catching himself before falling but revealing how close both animals were to serious trouble. The stallion's usual sure-footedness was compromised by exhaustion and dehydration, making every step a calculated risk. Bandit was faring marginally better, her smaller size and mountain conditioning providing advantages in the extreme conditions. But even she was beginning to show the strain, her breathing labored and her usual alertness dulled by the cumulative effects of heat and effort. The trail began climbing again as they approached the high ridge that had provided such spectacular views during their outward journey. The ascent that had been challenging when both horses were fresh now loomed as a potentially insurmountable obstacle. Several hundred feet of steep terrain awaited them, with no alternative routes available. Garrett made a tactical decision that would either win or lose the race. Instead of following Ayana's direct approach to the climb, he guided Bandit toward a series of switchbacks that added distance but reduced the severity of the grade. The route would take longer, but it offered their best chance of reaching the top without completely exhausting the Mare. Ayana glanced back as she realized his strategy, her expression revealing both respect for his tactical thinking and determination to maintain her advantage despite the brutal conditions. She urged Hoki up the steeper direct route, gambling that the stallion's superior power would compensate for the additional strain. The gamble appeared to pay off initially. Hoki attacked the slope with reserves of strength that seemed impossible given their circumstances, his powerful stride eating up vertical distance with impressive efficiency. Ayana rode with perfect balance, her weight distributed to provide maximum assistance to her struggling mount. But the effort was unsustainable. Halfway up the slope, Hoki's pace began to falter. His breathing became increasingly labored, and foam from his mouth was tinged with the pink froth that indicated serious respiratory distress. The stallion was approaching the limits of his endurance, pushed beyond sustainable levels by the combination of heat, altitude, and continuous exertion. Ayana recognized the danger immediately. Her people had survived in this harsh environment for generations, learning to read the subtle signs that differentiated manageable stress from life-threatening exhaustion. She dismounted and began leading Hoki up the remaining portion of the slope on foot, reducing the burden on his overworked cardiovascular system. Garrett's longer route was proving more sustainable. Bandit maintained a steady pace up the gentler grade, her breathing difficult but still within manageable parameters. The Maori's mountain breeding and careful conditioning were paying dividends in the extreme conditions. He reached the ridge top to find Ayana already there, but both she and Hoki were clearly in distress. The stallion stood with his head hanging low, sides heaving as he struggled to process oxygen in the thin air. Pink foam continued to fleck his muzzle, a sign that immediate rest was essential to prevent permanent damage. "He needs water and shade," Garrett said, dismounting beside them. "I know." Ayana's voice carried frustration and genuine concern for her horse's welfare. "But there's no shade up here, and we're both down to our last few swallows." The ridge offered no protection from the blazing sun, which had now angled to strike them with increased intensity as it dropped toward the western horizon. Heat radiated from every rock surface, creating an environment that seemed designed to test the limits of survival. Garrett made a decision that surprised them both. He retrieved his remaining water and offered half to Ayana for her horse. "Why?" she asked. "Because that stallion deserves better than dying for human stupidity." She studied his face for a long moment, searching for ulterior motives or strategic deception. Finding neither, she accepted the water and carefully administered it to Hoki, who drank gratefully despite his obvious distress. The gesture changed something fundamental between them. Competition remained, but it was now tempered by mutual respect and the shared understanding that survival took precedence over any prize their race might offer. The descent from the ridge proved treacherous for both exhausted horses. Loose stones and steep grades created constant hazards, while heat exhaustion affected their natural sure-footedness. Both riders dismounted and led their animals down the most difficult sections, accepting the additional time and energy expenditure as necessary for safety. Bandit's condition was deteriorating rapidly. The Mare's usual alertness had given way to a glazed expression that indicated severe dehydration and possibly the early stages of heat stroke. Her gait became increasingly unsteady, and several times she stumbled on terrain that would have presented no challenge under normal circumstances. With 3 miles remaining to the Devil's Head, both horses were approaching the limits of their endurance. The afternoon sun continued its relentless assault, and the final stretch of trail offered no respite from the brutal conditions. Ayana called a halt beside a small outcropping that provided minimal shade. "We need to rest them," she said. "Push any harder and we'll lose both horses." Garrett nodded agreement, though every minute of delay increased the risk of being caught by darkness in terrain that was dangerous enough in full daylight. They had perhaps 2 hours of usable light remaining, barely sufficient to complete the journey under ideal conditions. Both horses stood with heads hanging, their breathing labored and irregular. Hoki's condition remained particularly concerning, with continued signs of respiratory distress that suggested internal damage from overexertion in extreme heat. "There's another spring about a mile ahead," Ayanna said. "If we can get them there... They might not make it that far." The brutal reality hung between them like a physical presence. Both riders had pushed their mounts beyond reasonable limits in pursuit of a goal that was beginning to seem meaningless compared to the lives of the animals that had carried them so faithfully. The desert stretched endlessly around them, beautiful and merciless under the late afternoon sun. Somewhere ahead lay safety and the completion of their challenge. But first, they had to survive the next hour.